Night fell over Ouagadougou's airport, the capital of Burkina Faso, like a soft velvet curtain draping the city's twinkling lights. The air carried the dry, dusty breath of the desert, mingling with the scent of jet fuel and the low hum of late-night flights. In the international terminal, passengers moved slowly, their suitcases rolling across the marble floor in a steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of a sleeping beast. In a quiet corner near the Air France check-in counter, a man stood unobtrusively, almost blending into the crowd. He was unremarkable at first glance. Dressed in a faded blue cotton shirt, slightly worn at the collar, and simple khaki pants, he wore scuffed but polished leather shoes. A rough canvas backpack hung from his shoulder, the kind favored by seasoned travelers. His sun-weathered face, etched with quiet resolve, held an indescribable calm. His deep eyes, like desert wells, observed everything without betraying emotion. No one in the bustling crowd noticed him. No one suspected that this man was Ibrahim Traoré, the President of Burkina Faso, the young leader who had ignited a nation's pride. Traoré stood in line, patiently waiting his turn. He asked for no special treatment, no entourage or bodyguards surrounded him. Only his young aide, Moussa, stood a few steps away, carrying a small suitcase and a worried expression. Moussa glanced at him, lips pressed tight as if to speak, but Traoré's calm, resolute gaze silenced him. The president had been clear before the trip. No revealing his identity, no drawing attention. This was a personal journey, a quiet mission to meet other African leaders at a discreet summit in Paris. For Traoré, humility wasn't just a virtue, it was a statement. At the Air France counter, a middle-aged woman with neatly pinned blonde hair looked up as Traoré approached. Her smile was professional but cold, lacking warmth. "Passport," she said flatly, eyes fixed on her computer screen. Traoré silently placed his passport on the counter. It was a diplomatic passport, its cover worn and unassuming, giving no hint of his status as a head of state. The woman flipped through it, her brows knitting slightly as she studied the photo and details. "Reason for travel to Paris?" she asked, her tone tinged with suspicion, as if questioning a dubious passenger. "Work," Traoré replied, his voice low and concise. He offered no further explanation, feeling no need to. The woman glanced up, eyeing him from head to toe, his worn shirt, scuffed shoes, and old backpack. A faint smirk crossed her lips. "What kind of work dresses like this?" she muttered, just loud enough to assume he wouldn't hear. But Traoré did. He stood still, hands clasped, his expression unchanged. Moussa behind him clenched his fists. He wanted to step forward, to shout who this man was, but a glance from Traoré froze him in place. The president wanted no spectacle. Not here, not now. After a longer-than-needed check, the woman stamped his passport and slid it back. "Gate 12, she said without looking at him. "Don't be late." Traoré nodded, took his passport, and walked away, Moussa hurrying behind. As they headed to security, a group of sharply dressed businessmen or officials brushed past. One, a Frenchman with salt and pepper hair and a gleaming watch, bumped into Traoré. He turned, glaring with disdain. "Watch where you're going," he snapped in French, his tone icy, before striding off without waiting for a response. Moussa gritted his teeth, but Traoré placed a hand on his shoulder, shaking his head. "Let them go," he said softly but firmly. "They're not worth our time." This small moment was a sign of things to come. A storm was quietly brewing, not in Ouagadougou's night sky, but in the hearts of those who underestimated the man they dismissed. The Air France flight waiting at Gate 12 wasn't just a plane to Paris. It was the stage for a lesson in dignity, pride, and the power of humility. As Traoré passed through security, the airport lights cast his shadow long across the marble floor, a symbol of unwavering resolve. In the distance, the roar of jet engines echoed, as if the sky itself awaited the story about to unfold. The loudspeaker crackled at Gate 12, a monotonous female voice announcing that Air France flight AF738 to Paris was boarding. Passengers gathered in clusters, suitcases rolling, voices mingling with the sharp tap of heels on marble. Under the terminal's cold white lights, Ibrahim Traoré stood near the back of the line, his canvas backpack still slung over his shoulder. Moussa, his aide, hovered close, scanning the crowd warily. No one in the hurried throng recognized the unassuming man, exactly as Traoré intended. As the line moved, Traoré climbed the steps to the plane. A chilly desert breeze swept past, a reminder of the journey ahead. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of expensive cologne and new leather seats, creating a luxurious but stifling atmosphere. Traoré was assigned a seat in business class, not by his choice, but because Moussa had insisted a head of state couldn't fly economy, though Traoré cared little for such details. A tall, slender flight attendant with neatly tied brown hair greeted passengers at the cabin door. Her smile beamed for the sharply dressed travelers, but it faltered when Traoré approached. She glanced at his worn shirt, scuffed shoes, and old backpack, her eyes flickering with doubt. "Your ticket?" she asked, her tone polite but edged with frost. Traoré handed her his boarding pass. She checked it, her brows furrowing when she saw his business class seat. "Business class is up front, sir," she said, her voice tinged with surprise. Traoré nodded silently and moved on. Moussa, trailing behind, shot her a glare, but she had already turned to the next passenger. In the business class cabin, spacious leather seats and polished tray tables gleamed under soft lighting. Some passengers sipped champagne served before takeoff. Traoré found his seat, 4A, by the window. He set his backpack on the floor, settled in, and gazed out at the twinkling runway lights. Moussa, in the seat beside him, muttered about the flight attendant's attitude, but Traoré raised a hand, signaling silence. Tension stirred as a man entered the cabin. He was about 50, dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit, a red silk tie standing out against his crisp white shirt. A gold watch gleamed on his wrist, and his cologne announced his status. This was the man who had bumped into Traoré at security, and now he was heading straight for seat 4B, right next to him. "Well, really?" the man muttered in French, eyeing Traoré as if he were out of place. He paused, hands on hips, inspecting Traoré like a misplaced object. "I didn't know Air France let just anyone into business class now." Traoré didn't look up. He kept his gaze on the window, his face calm as a still lake. Moussa gripped his armrest, ready to leap up, but a glance from Traoré stopped him. The man, getting no reaction, snorted and sat in 4B. He snapped his fingers at a flight attendant. "You, get me a whiskey, quick!" The attendant nodded, clearly used to such demands. He turned to Traoré, a smug smile curling his lips. "First time in business class, friend? Don't worry, just sit tight and don't do anything foolish." His words were sharp, meant to wound. Nearby passengers, a well-dressed older couple and a woman reading a magazine, glanced over but said nothing. The cabin's air grew heavy, like a storm gathering. Traoré finally turned, meeting the man's eyes. His gaze wasn't angry or hostile, but deep and steady, as if seeing through to the man's core. "I know my place," he said, his voice low and clear. "Do you?" The words cut like a blade, short but sharp. The man blinked, caught off guard by the calm, weighty response. He forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow, masking unease. "Fine, fine," he said, turning away to sip his whiskey. "We'll see." The plane began to taxi, its engines roaring as the cabin lights dimmed. Only the soft glow of reading lights remained. Traoré looked back out the window, where Burkina Faso's desert darkness faded behind. But inside him a small fire burned, not of anger, but of dignity and pride. He knew this flight was more than a journey. It was a test, a chance to prove that humility wasn't weakness, but the strength of a nation. In the seat beside him, the man in the gray suit sipped his whiskey, stealing glances at Traore. He didn't know he had just sparked a larger story, one where he would soon be a minor character, overshadowed by the man he scorned. As the plane lifted off, soaring into the night sky, the cabin fell into a tense silence. The hum of engines blended with the heartbeats of those inside, each carrying their own story. But no one, not even the most arrogant, could guess that the quiet man in 4A carried the weight of a nation on his shoulders. The Air France flight, AF 738, glided through the night sky, its engines humming steadily like the breath of a giant. In the business-class cabin, soft reading lights cast pools of light and shadow, mirroring the contrasts among the passengers. Ibrahim Traoré sat in 4A, gazing out at clouds drifting under the silvery moonlight. His calm face belied the weight of the stares directed at him, some curious, some scornful, and some hostile. Beside him, the man in the gray suit, who introduced himself as Philippe Dubois, a French mining executive, disrupted the quiet. Dubois, on his second whiskey, radiated arrogance as he glanced at Traoré. He couldn't stand the man's silence, as if Traoré's calm was a direct challenge to his status. "Hey, friend," Dubois said, his tone falsely friendly but dripping with sarcasm. "I bet you've never left your village before, huh? Paris will blow your mind," he laughed loudly, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. A middle-aged woman in gold-rimmed glasses, reading a fashion magazine, smirked in agreement. Traoré didn't respond immediately. He turned slowly, his deep eyes locking onto Dubois. "Paris won't overwhelm me," he said, his voice steady and low. "But it might surprise you." His words carried a hidden depth, like a stone dropped into a still pond, rippling in ways Dubois couldn't yet grasp. Dubois blinked, his smile faltering. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially by someone he deemed beneath him. He grunted, waving for another whiskey. But unease had crept into his mind, a crack in his wall of arrogance. Moussa, in 4C, gripped his armrest tightly. He wanted to shout that Dubois was mocking the President of Burkina Faso, but Traoré's sharp, commanding glance kept him silent. Moussa understood Traoré's wish to remain anonymous, for now. This wasn't just a flight, it was a test of human dignity in a world clouded by prejudice. The tension rose as another flight attendant, a young man with blonde hair and a smug smile, appeared with a food cart. When he reached Traoré's row, he paused, eyeing him skeptically. "Sir," he said, his tone faintly condescending, "are you sure you want this dish? It's complex. Maybe something simpler?" His words were a deliberate jab. A few nearby passengers snickered, their laughter like pebbles dropping into still water. Moussa clenched his jaw, but Traoré smiled faintly. Not a smile of weakness, but of absolute confidence. "Let me try it," he said calmly, his voice carrying quiet authority. "I think I'll manage." The attendant shrugged, setting the plate down with a careless thud before moving on. Dubois, watching, chuckled. "They know how to handle people like you, don't they?" he said venomously. "Don't take it personally, friend. Not everyone belongs here." His words were a cold gust, chilling the cabin's air. But Traoré didn't react. He picked up his fork, eating slowly with a grace that seemed out of place in the tense cabin, as if dining in a palace. His calm was a silent declaration, a reminder that dignity lay not in clothing or status, but in facing scorn with strength. Meanwhile, at the back of the cabin, another passenger watched. Aissata, a 30-year-old Malian freelance journalist, wore a dark green sweater and scribbled in a small notebook. She was headed to Paris for a conference on African development. Aissata had noticed Traoré since boarding, not for his appearance, but for his response to disdain, a calm she'd only seen in those with a greater purpose. She tilted her head, jotting down, "Man in 4A. Who is he?" She sensed something extraordinary, but couldn't name it. When her eyes met Traoré's across the cabin, he gave a slight nod, as if acknowledging her curiosity. Aissata smiled faintly, then wrote more, her heart racing with the feeling she was witnessing a story worth telling. The plane sailed on, clouds outside like ghosts of past and future. In the cabin, whispers spread, mocking words, scornful glances, and silent questions about the quiet man in 4A. But Traoré sat unmoved, like a mountain, his gaze fixed ahead where Paris waited. The tension thickened, like the air before a storm. Dubois, the young attendant, and other passengers didn't know they were part of a larger story, one whose end would force them to face themselves. At its center was Ibrahim Traoré, his humility and pride carrying the weight of a nation, quietly preparing for the moment the truth would be revealed. The Air France flight, AF 738, soared through the night, moonlight glinting off its wings as it cut through scattered clouds. In the business class cabin, the atmosphere was taut, like a bowstring ready to snap. The stares, whispered taunts, and Traoré's defiant silence wove a tense symphony, with each passenger an unwitting player. Traoré sat in 4A, hands clasped, gazing out at the stormy clouds lit by distant lightning. He ignored Dubois' mockery and the young attendant's subtle slights, who served him slower than others. These weren't new to him. He'd seen them before, in skeptical looks at international summits, in half-hearted handshakes from diplomats, in veiled comments about countries like Burkina Faso. But he chose silence, knowing it could speak louder than words when used right. Moussa, in 4C, lacked such calm. Each jab from Dubois, each disdainful glance from the attendant, stabbed at his pride. He looked to Traoré, hoping for a signal to speak, but the president shook his head, his eyes saying, "Not yet." Suddenly, the plane lurched violently. A shrill whine came from the engines, and the cabin shuddered. Lights flickered, then went out for seconds, sparking panic. Screams erupted, Dubois' wine glass spilled, staining his shirt red. The woman in gold-rimmed glasses clung to her husband, whispering prayers. The young attendant at the back nearly fell, gripping the food cart. "What's happening?" Dubois shouted, his voice trembling. He turned to Traoré, as if seeking answers from the man he'd mocked, but Traoré sat still, hands clasped, eyes on the window. His calm, amid chaos, was a beacon in a storm. The loudspeaker crackled, the pilot's voice strained but steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing turbulence and a minor technical issue. Please keep your seatbelts fastened and follow crew instructions." The announcement did little to ease panic. Dubois, pale, muttered about not deserving to die on a flight like this. The young attendant, his smugness gone, rushed down the aisle, checking seatbelts, his own fear evident. When he reached Traoré, he hesitated. "Your seatbelt, is it secure?" he asked, voice faltering, unsure if he should care. Traoré nodded. "Thank you," he said, his tone sincere. The simple gratitude amid chaos startled the attendant. He nodded awkwardly and moved on, avoiding Traoré's steady gaze. The plane shook again, harder, dislodging overhead luggage. More screams rang out. Even Moussa's worry showed, his hands gripping the armrests. He glanced at Traoré. "Sir, will we be okay?" he whispered. Traoré turned, placing a hand on Moussa's shoulder. "We've faced bigger storms," he said, his voice carrying strength beyond the cabin. "Trust." At the back, Aissata clutched her notebook, her heart racing but silent. She watched Traoré, his straight posture, his calming touch to his aide, his unshaken demeanor. She scribbled, "Man in 4A, the calm of a leader." She didn't know his identity, but sensed he wasn't ordinary. As the plane stabilized, lights returned, but tension lingered. Dubois, soaked in wine and stripped of arrogance, glared at Traoré, both angry and confused. "You aren't scared?" he demanded almost accusingly. "Or are you too foolish to understand what's happening?" His words drew every eye to Traoré, waiting for a response, but Traoré only smiled, a smile heavy with centuries of pride. "Fear won't land us safely," he said, his voice steady. "Courage might." His words rippled through the cabin, silencing Dubois. The young attendant nearby lowered his head, ashamed of his earlier actions. Aissata, scribbling every word, felt her pulse quicken, sensing history unfolding. The plane pressed on, but the cabin had changed. The turbulence hadn't just spilled wine and luggage. It had exposed cracks in the arrogance of those who scorned Traoré. Dubois, though still defiant, stayed silent. The attendant served Traoré with reluctant respect, and Aissata, her notebook filling, knew she held a story that could shake the world. Traoré gazed out the window, unmoved. He sought no apologies, no recognition. For him, this flight was more than a journey to Paris. It was a reminder that a nation's dignity and pride could weather any storm, in the sky or in human hearts. The Air France flight AF738 continued its journey, its engines a steady roar like an unyielding warrior's heartbeat. After the violent turbulence, the business-class cabin settled into an eerie silence, as if everyone held their breath, waiting for something greater to unfold. The soft glow of reading lights framed Ibrahim Traoré's face in 4A, casting a faint golden halo, as if he were a statue carved from Africa's pride. Traoré sat calmly, hands clasped, gazing at the moonlit clouds. His composure, after enduring Dubois' taunts and the young attendant's disdain, wasn't mere endurance. It was a declaration. He didn't need to shout to prove his worth. His presence, though simple, shook the prejudices around him. Dubois, in 4B, had lost his swagger. His wine-stained shirt and wavering eyes betrayed his unease. He glanced at Traoré, wanting to reclaim his status, but each time he met those deep, steady eyes, he felt small. He muttered about people who don't know their place, but the words lacked conviction. Moussa, in 4C, sat quietly, his heart pounding with pride. He sensed the moment of revelation nearing. He knew Traoré wanted anonymity, but the arrogance around them tested even the president's patience. Moussa looked to him, seeking a sign, but Traoré's faint smile was a mountain's unyielding strength. At the back, Aissata, the Malian journalist, scribbled furiously. She noted Traoré's every move, his dignity under scorn, his calm in chaos, his gentle reassurance to his aide. She wrote, "Man in 4A, a leader, but who?" Her instincts screamed that he was extraordinary, and she resolved to learn more. Pretending to head to the restroom, she moved closer to his row, hoping for a clue. The loudspeaker crackled again, the pilot's voice urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing an issue with one engine. We'll divert to the nearest airport for inspection. Please stay calm and follow crew instructions." The announcement struck like lightning. Whispers turned to cries. Dubois, ashen, slammed his whiskey glass down. "Damn it! I knew this flight was a mistake," he shouted, trembling. The woman in gold-rimmed glasses sobbed, her husband comforting her despite his own shaking hands. The young attendant, his smugness gone, rushed to calm passengers, his fear obvious. Amid the chaos, Traoré remained still. He turned to Moussa, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Breathe," he said firmly. "We'll get through this." Moussa nodded, though his hands clung to the armrests. Aissata, near the aisle, watched Traoré's unshaken calm. She seized her chance, feigning a stumble from a slight jolt, and stopped near his seat. "Excuse me," she said softly but clearly. "May I ask you something?" Traoré turned, his eyes assessing her intent. "Go ahead," he replied calmly. Aissata smiled, keeping her tone natural. "I'm a journalist. You're so calm in this crisis. Do you have experience with emergencies?" Her question probed but was genuine. Traoré's faint smile held mystery and strength. "I've faced many storms," he said, his voice a quiet proclamation. "And I've learned calm is the strongest weapon." His words stopped her. She wanted to ask more, but an older flight attendant, stern-faced, urged her back to her seat. Aissata nodded, sharing a glance with Traoré, a silent promise to tell his story. Meanwhile, Dubois, unable to bear Traoré's silence, stood despite crew instructions. "Hey!" he shouted, pointing at Traoré. "Who do you think you are, sitting there like nothing's wrong? You don't belong here. A nobody like you." His words were cut off by Traoré's icy glare. This time, Traoré didn't stay silent. He stood, slowly but with commanding presence, his tall frame filling the cabin. "A nobody like me," he repeated, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "What do you know about me, sir?" The cabin froze. All eyes turned to Traoré. Dubois, startled by the confrontation, stepped back, but his pride pushed him on. "I know enough," he snapped. "You're a fluke, in the wrong seat, pretending to be calm to impress." Traoré didn't respond immediately. His gaze pierced Dubois' soul. Then he spoke, slow and resonant. "You can think what you want of me, but don't mistake humility for weakness, or arrogance for strength." His words shattered Dubois' bravado. The man opened his mouth but found no retort. The young attendant nearby lowered his head, ashamed. Aissata, scribbling, felt her heart race, knowing she was witnessing history. The plane pressed on, but the cabin had changed forever. The brief clash wasn't just an argument, it was a silent declaration of war, a reminder that dignity couldn't be dimmed by prejudice. As the plane prepared for an emergency landing, Traoré sat, his gaze forward, ready for the greater stage awaiting him. The Air France flight AF738 tilted slightly as it descended, its engines roaring against the howling wind outside. In the business class cabin, lights flickered, reflecting the unease in passengers' hearts. After the charged confrontation between Traoré and Dubois, the air was thick, like a sky before a storm. Every glance, open or covert, fixed on the unassuming man in 4A, who seemed to carry an inexplicable power. Traoré sat calmly, hands clasped, staring at dark clouds torn by distant lightning. His composure, amid Dubois' taunts and the crew's subtle slights, was more than personal. It was a symbol of a nation that had weathered history's storms. Moussa, in 4C, gripped his armrests, but his eyes glowed with pride. He'd seen Traoré turn scorn into a lesson in dignity. He knew the moment of revelation was near, and he stood ready behind his leader. The loudspeaker crackled, the pilot's voice tinged with relief. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're preparing to land at Dakar International Airport. Please keep seatbelts fastened and follow crew instructions. We'll get you to safety soon." The words eased some panic, but tension lingered. Dubois muttered about suing Air France, his voice weak. The young attendant, stripped of his earlier arrogance, moved nervously, avoiding Traoré's row. Aissata, clutching her notebook, scribbled every detail of this fateful flight. As the plane descended, another jolt shook the cabin, prompting screams. Luggage fell from overhead bins, nearly hitting a passenger. The young attendant rushed to restore order, but chaos reigned. In that moment, Traoré stood, his voice low but commanding. "Everyone, stay calm. Sit tight and follow instructions. We'll be safe." His words, simple yet powerful, hushed the cabin. The young attendant looked at him, stunned, then nodded, realizing Traoré was no ordinary passenger. Dubois, clinging to his seat, stayed silent. Aissata wrote, "Man in 4A, a leader's voice in the storm." The plane touched down in Dakar, tires screeching on the rain-soaked runway. Outside, a downpour blurred the airport lights. When the plane stopped, passengers clapped, some crying in relief. But Traoré remained seated, his gaze forward, as if knowing the real challenge lay ahead. The cabin door opened, and Dakar airport staff in bright raincoats guided passengers off. A Senegalese officer in military uniform, clearly senior, entered the cabin, his eyes scanning with authority. Escorted by security, his presence heightened the tension. He stopped near Traoré's row, his face lighting up in recognition. "Mr. Traoré?" he asked, his voice low but respectful. Traoré nodded, standing, his tall frame commanding the space. "That's me," he said, his voice calm but weighty. Whispers erupted. Dubois, pale, stared, mouth agape. The young attendant froze, hands trembling as he realized his mistake. Aissata nearly leapt from her seat, her pen pausing. "Traoré, President of Burkina Faso?" she whispered, her heart racing as the puzzle completed. The officer bowed slightly. "Sir, we were informed of your presence. The Senegalese government apologizes for the incident and invites you to the VIP area to rest before continuing. We'll ensure your safety." Traoré smiled, a blend of humility and pride. "Thank you," he said, "but I'll stay with the other passengers. They need care, too." His words eased the cabin's tension. The officer nodded, visibly impressed by Traoré's humility. He signaled his team, and evacuation began. But before leaving, Traoré turned to Dubois, his eyes meaningful but not angry. "Dignity isn't in the seat you occupy," he said, his voice resonant, "but in how you treat others." Dubois didn't reply. He lowered his head, silenced for the first time. The young attendant blushed, eyes full of regret. Aissata, still writing, smiled, knowing her story was more than an article. It was a declaration. As Traoré stepped off the plane, rain fell, but airport lights cast a halo around him. Moussa followed, head high with pride. Aissata, among the passengers, clutched her notebook, determined to share this story with the world. The storm outside raged, but in the hearts of those who witnessed it, another storm had begun, one of change, pride, and the truth about the humble man who shook an entire flight. Rain poured over Dakar's international airport, heavy drops pounding the metal canopy, creating a chaotic yet vibrant melody. Airport lights cut through the downpour, illuminating the path from the Air France flight AF 738 to the terminal, where soaked and weary passengers were led. Ibrahim Traoré descended the plane's steps, his worn shirt clinging to him in the rain, yet his stride was steady, like a baobab standing tall in the desert. Moussa followed, head high, his eyes glowing with pride for his leader. The terminal blazed with light, but the air was heavy with lingering tension from the flight. Passengers huddled in groups, some embracing in relief, others grumbling about the inconvenience. Philippe Dubois, his shirt stained with wine, stood alone near the information desk, his eyes flickering between anger and confusion. The young attendant, his arrogance gone, lingered near the entrance, stealing glances at Traoré, wrestling with regret. In a quiet corner, Aissata, the Malian journalist, gripped her notebook, her pen racing to capture every moment of this pivotal scene. Traoré, ignoring the stares, joined the other passengers in line for processing. He declined the Senegalese officer's offer to retreat to the VIP area, choosing to stand with everyone else. This small act made the officer bow again, his eyes filled with respect. "Sir," he said sincerely, "you are an example to us all." Traoré smiled faintly, a smile heavy with a nation's pride. "I'm just a man," he replied, "but I carry Burkina Faso's pride. That's what makes the difference." His words, though simple, echoed in the minds of those nearby. A few passengers, who had witnessed the confrontation on the plane, began to whisper. "The President of Burkina Faso?" an older woman asked her husband, stunned. "That man in the worn shirt?" Her husband nodded, his earlier disdain replaced by curiosity and respect. Dubois, overhearing, froze, his fists clenching. He couldn't believe the man he'd mocked, the nobody he'd dismissed, was a head of state. The truth pierced his pride, exposing cracks he'd hidden throughout the flight. He glanced at Traoré, wanting to salvage his dignity, but the president's steady gaze silenced him. For the first time, Philippe Dubois felt small. The young attendant, mustering courage, approached Traoré, hands trembling, eyes downcast. "Sir," he stammered, I'm sorry for how I treated you on the flight. I didn't know. I was wrong." Traoré looked at him, his gaze kind but firm. He placed a hand on the attendant's shoulder, a simple gesture brimming with strength. "Mistakes are human," he said. "What matters is what you learn from them." The attendant nodded, eyes teary, then stepped back, as if freed from an invisible burden. Aissata, watching, felt her heart race. She knew this story was more than an article, it was a testament that dignity could overcome prejudice. She approached Traoré, notebook in hand. "Mr. Traoré," she said respectfully, "I'm Aissata, a journalist from Mali. I saw you on the flight, and I want to tell your story, not just for Africa, but for the world." Traoré studied her, his eyes lingering on her notebook and pen, as if weighing her mission. Then he smiled, blending humility and pride. "The story isn't about me," he said. "It's about people like you, like the people of Burkina Faso, like all of us who carry Africa's pride. Tell that story." His words ignited Aissata's heart. She nodded, tears glistening, and wrote her final note. Ibrahim Traoré, the man who taught the world about dignity. As passengers were led out to rest or continue their journeys, Traoré paused, gazing through a window. The rain had stopped, and the first light of dawn painted Dakar's sky a vibrant orange. He thought of Burkina Faso, of its resilient people who trusted him, and of the responsibility he carried. This flight, though challenging, was a small moment in his larger mission, to build a proud, united Africa that bowed to no prejudice. As Traoré left the terminal, local reporters, alerted to his presence, waited with cameras, calling his name. He raised a hand in a gentle wave, not stopping to boast. Moussa, beside him, smiled, knowing his humility was his greatest strength. Dubois, in a shadowed corner, watched Traoré's departure. For the first time he felt deep regret, not just for his words, but for how he viewed the world. Traoré's gaze, that look of pride and dignity, would haunt him forever. The young attendant returned to work, carrying a lesson he'd never forget. He began treating every passenger with respect, regardless of appearance. Aissata, back in Mali, wrote her article, not just about Flight AF 738, but about a man who changed her view of pride and humility. Published widely, it spread across Africa and beyond, becoming a symbol of the fight against prejudice and a celebration of human dignity. In Burkina Faso, Traoré's flight became legend. People shared it around campfires, in remote villages, and on Ouagadougou's bustling streets. They were proud not only of their president, but of themselves, carriers of Africa's unyielding spirit. When Traoré reached Paris, he entered the summit as simply as he had the flight, but his eyes carried a leader's strength. He spoke to fellow African leaders about unity, pride, and a future where dignity reigned. The room fell silent, listening, knowing these weren't just a president's words, they were the voice of a continent. Dawn had risen, not just in Dakar, but across Africa. In that light, Ibrahim Traoré, the man in the worn shirt, left an indelible legacy of pride, dignity, and the belief that humility could shake the world.